Can I start?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, good. So why is it important to talk about diversity and inclusion? Well, there's lots of reasons, and the reasons that come to mind most often for a lot of us is this first one: who's your workforce?
I'm sorry.
Can you see better?
Does that help with the glare? Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. But who's your workforce? Because demographics have changed. I mean, here in Northwest Arkansas, especially, I'm from Springdale, and so I like to talk about Springdale. A third of our population here is under the age of 18. Springdale is a very young city. And when I was growing up in Springdale, everybody in school looked like me. Everybody in school looked like me. Hispanic families, 0. African American families, 0. Marshallese families, 0. We were all white. And now, 12% of our population is probably Marshallese in Springdale. About 45% of our population is now Latino. So, we've changed. That's our workforce. We've got to change along with the workforce. And then who are our customers? Who are your customers? So a little bit more about me. This is my family. I've got 2 sons. One of them lives in North Carolina, like we were just talking about. The other one lives in Kansas. So I've got 4 grandkids. There they all are. The youngest one will be 6 months old on Thursday. Diversity and inclusion is kind of a natural topic for me. My father was disabled, and so with him having that disability, I grew up. Think about things a little bit differently. I have a sister-in-law who's African American, so some of my nephews have darker skin than some of my other nephews. There are lots of people I love who are lesbian or gay, transgender. Who you love really determines a lot about your view of the world and who you're willing to fight for. I taught Spanish in a community college in Colorado for a long time. But then being from here, I wanted to come back and be with Mother and Daddy in the last years of their lives, and I've never regretted that. Although it was kind of an adventure, I took a leave of absence from the community college where I was teaching and just moved home, not knowing what in the world I was going to do. But the timing was perfect. The Jones Center had just gotten a grant from the Walton Family Foundation to start a Department of Diversity and Inclusion. So it just really worked out beautifully. I was at the Jones Center for 6 years, and then they had a major shift a few years ago, and I was fortunate to move to NWAC then to continue being Director for Diversity and Inclusion there. There's something about working in diversity and inclusion, though, that's a little bit daunting, because you're always afraid that people view you as somebody who's going to maybe become holier than thou, or trying to always tell you where you're wrong and when you're doing something wrong. That's so not it. That is so not it. Because, boy, it's a learning experience for all of us, all the way through life. I mean, I'm 66, still learning, right? So we'll always just keep on learning. But diversity and inclusion is really about learning how to respect other people, learning to accept different viewpoints that aren't yours, learning to honor life experiences that aren't yours. So that's what diversity and inclusion is about. But now is everybody comfortable standing up? We'll get to that in a second, so don't pay too much attention to that now. But you all are good with standing up. So stand up if you went to high school in Springdale. I am the only person standing. Okay, you are good. Stand up if you've always lived in the same state. All right. You can sit back there. Stand up if you've gone to a baseball game this season. U of A, Naturals? Kansas City? Naturals? Yeah. Good, thank you. Stand up if you've been the only person of your race or ethnicity in a meeting. And you have as well?
Yes.
Yep. And you know what? Our colleagues who are African American, or our colleagues who are Latino, or our colleagues who are Marshallese have that experience a lot, right? And we need to be mindful of that. So stand up if you've lived in more than 3 states. Yeah, a lot of it. Yep. And it's very broadening, I think, to live in different places, have different life experiences, see different points of view. So stand up if you've ever been the only person from your generation in a meeting. Yeah, how does that feel? Daunting? Yeah. Does it make you less likely to speak up? Maybe?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Stand up if you speak more than one language. Yeah. Stand up if you work out 3 times a week or more.
Try.
Try count. Yeah, that's good. And then stand up if you ate out or had carry out yesterday. Yeah, afterward. There we all are. And we all just have different life experiences. We all bring our life experiences with us to work. We bring our life experiences with us to our relationships. And how do we then honor other people's different life experiences as we go? I want to show you a TED Talk now, and maybe you've seen it before. Even if you have, I hope you'll enjoy it again. But what I want you to really think about as you're listening to her, is Chimamanda Adichie, is what in her experience really resonates with you, right? And then what do you just get that she's talking about? So it's about 18 minutes, 19 minutes. And that didn't work, so we're going to go with it. Oh, gosh. Okay. I had it up somewhere. Let's see. Yeah, click on that. Maybe that comes up. There, yay. Okay. Should put my glasses on.
I'm a storyteller, and
This room has a lot of challenges with streaming.
I would like to tell you a few personal stories about
There you go.
what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer, and when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow, they ate apples, and they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria, I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow, we ate mangoes, and we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them, and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books, but because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamara Laye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination, they opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was it saved me from having a single story of what books are. I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, living domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. That poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music. I was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me as an African was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. I must say that before I went to the US, I didn't consciously identify as African. But in the US, whenever Africa came up, people turned to me, never mind that I knew nothing about places like Namibia. But I did come to embrace this new identity, and in many ways I think of myself now as African, although I still get quite irritable when Africa is referred to as a country, the most recent example being my otherwise wonderful flight from Lagos 2 days ago, in which there was an announcement on the Virgin flight about their charity walk in India, Africa, and other countries. So after I had spent some years in the US as an African, I began to understand my roommate's response to me. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, had seen Fide's family. This single story of Africa ultimately comes, I think, from Western literature. Now here's a quote from the writing of a London merchant called John Locke, who sailed to West Africa in 1561 and kept a fascinating account of his voyage. After referring to the black Africans as beasts who have no houses, he writes, "They are also people without heads, having their mouths and eyes in their breasts." Now, I've laughed every time I've read this, and one must admire the imagination of John Locke. But what's important about his writing is that it represents the beginning of a tradition of telling African stories in the West, a tradition of sub-Saharan Africa as a place of negative, of difference, of darkness, of people who, in the words of the wonderful poet, Rudyard Kipling, are half devil, half child. And so I began to realize that my American roommate must have, throughout her life, seen and heard different versions of this single story. I've had a professor who once told me that my novel was not authentically African. Now, I was quite willing to contend that there were a number of things wrong with the novel, that it had failed in a number of cases, but I had not quite imagined that it had failed at achieving something called African authenticity. In fact, I did not know what African authenticity was. The professor told me that my characters were too much like him, an educated and middle-class man. My characters drove cars. They were not starving. Therefore, they were not authentically African. But I must quickly add that I too am just as guilty in the question of a single story. A few years ago, I visited Mexico from the US. The political climate in the US at the time was tense, and there were debates going on about immigration. And, as often happens in America, immigration became synonymous with Mexicans. There were endless stories of Mexicans as people who were fleecing the healthcare system, sneaking across the border, being arrested at the border, that sort of thing. I remember walking around on my first day in Guadalajara, watching the people going to work, rolling up tortillas in the marketplace, smoking, laughing. I remember first feeling slight surprise, and then I was overwhelmed with shame. I realized that I had been so immersed in the media coverage of Mexicans that they had become one thing in my mind, the abject immigrant. I had bought into the single story of Mexicans, and I could not have been more ashamed of myself. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. It is impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. There is a word, an Igbo word, that I think about whenever I think about the power structures of the world, and it is nkali. It's a noun that loosely translates to be greater than another. Like our economic and political walls, stories too are defined by the principle of nkali. How they are told, who tells them, when they are told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. The Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with secondly. Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Start the story with the failure of the African state and not with the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story. I recently spoke at a university where a student told me that it was such a shame that Nigerian men were physical abusers like the father character in my novel. I told him that I had just read a novel called American Psycho, and that it was such a shame that young Americans were serial murderers. Now, obviously I said this in a fit of mild irritation, but it would never have occurred to me to think that just because I had read a novel in which a character was a serial killer, that he was somehow representative of all Americans. And now this is not because I'm a better person than that student, but because of America's cultural and economic power, I had many stories of America. I had read Thailand, Updike, and Steinbeck, and Gateskill. I did not have a single story of America. When I learned some years ago that writers were expected to have had really unhappy childhoods to be successful, I began to think about how I could invent horrible things my parents had done to me. But the truth is that I had a very happy childhood, full of laughter and love, in a very close-knit family. But I also had grandfathers who died in refugee camps. My cousin, Polly, died because he could not get adequate health care. One of my closest friends, Ukuloma, died in a plane crash because our fire trucks did not have water. I grew up under repressive military governments that devalued education so that sometimes my parents were not paid their salaries. And so as a child, I saw jam disappear from the breakfast table. Then margarine disappeared. Then bread became too expensive. Then milk became rationed. And most of all, a kind of normalized political fear invaded our lives. All of these stories make me who I am. But to insist on only these negative stories is to flatten my experience and to overlook the many other stories that formed me. The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. Of course, Africa is a continent full of catastrophes, the immense ones, such as the horrific rapes in Congo, and depressing ones, such as the fact that 5,000 people apply for one job vacancy in Nigeria. But there are other stories that are not about catastrophe, and it is very important, it is just as important to talk about them. I've always felt that it is impossible to engage properly with a place or a person without engaging with all of the stories of that place and that person. The consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar. So what if before my dad had followed the immigration and the Mexican? What if my family was poor and hardworking? What if we had an African television network that broadcast diverse African stories all over the world? What the Nigerian writer calls a balance of stories. What if my roommate knew about my Nigerian publisher, Muktaba, and who left his job in a bank to follow his dream and start a publishing house? Now, the conventional wisdom was that Nigerians don't read literature. He disagreed. He felt that people who could read would read if you made literature affordable and available to them. Shortly after he published my first novel, I went to a TV station in Lagos to do an interview. And a woman who worked there as a messenger came up to me and said, "I really liked your novel. I didn't like the ending. Now you must write a sequel, and this is what will happen." And she went on to tell me what to write in the sequel. Now, I was not only charmed, I was very moved. Here was a woman, part of the ordinary masses of Nigerians who are not supposed to be readers. She had not only read the book, but she had taken ownership of it and felt justified in telling me what to write in the sequel. Now, what if my roommate knew about my friend, Fumi Yonda, a fearless woman who hosts a TV show in Lagos and is determined to tell the stories that we prefer to forget? What if my roommate knew about the heart procedure that was performed in the Lagos hospital last week? What if my roommate knew about contemporary Nigerian music, talented people singing in English and Pidgin and Igbo and Yoruba and Ijo, mixing influences from Jay-Z to Fela to Bob Marley to their grandfathers? What if my roommate knew about the female lawyer who recently went to court in Nigeria to challenge a ridiculous law that required women to get their husband's consent before renewing their passports? What if my roommate knew about Nollywood, full of innovative people making films despite great technical odds? Films so popular that they really are the best example of Nigerians consuming what they produce. What if my roommate knew about my wonderfully ambitious hair braider who has just started her own business selling hair extensions? Or about the millions of other Nigerians who start businesses and sometimes fail, but continue to nurse ambition? Every time I am home, I'm confronted with the usual sources of irritation for most Nigerians: our failed infrastructure, our failed government, but also by the incredible resilience of people who thrive despite the government rather than because of it. I teach writing workshops in Lagos every summer, and it is amazing to me how many people apply, how many people are eager to write, to tell stories. My Nigerian publisher and I have just started a non-profit called Farafina Trust, and we have big dreams of building libraries and refurbishing libraries that already exist and providing books for state schools that don't have anything in their libraries, and also organizing lots and lots of workshops on reading and writing for all the people who are eager to tell our many stories. Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of the people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. The American writer Alice Walker wrote this about her southern relatives who had moved to the north, and she introduced them to a book about the southern life that they had left behind. They sat around reading the book themselves, listening to me read the book, and the kind of paradise was regained. I would like to end with this thought, that when we reject the single story, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise. Thank you.
This is Jim. He's a proud hotel owner, but Jim is front.
I want to talk to you. Thank you. Very good.
Yeah, for a second. Give me 1 second, let me get back on track here.
Okay. So let's just take a minute then. If you'll talk with somebody close to you about what really resonated with you from her talk. And did she say anything that's going to make you do anything differently? Okay, so would you just take about 5 minutes and just talk with each other then about those two things? What really resonated with you and what can you envision doing differently? Okay? Thank you.
You can email her.
It seems like it's not always people's first thought. So we're like destined to
Ask Ask Jane to receive. I should be on like 16.
Many times I've done or said something that I later just grimace when I remember. You know, I had a colleague from Kenya at NWAC, and I remember asking Mary about, some of the things that her roommate asked her about. Thank heaven Mary was very gracious and understanding. So there we are. But what about you all? What really resonated with you from her experience? Any?
Just get the whole story. Don't judge the book by the cover or don't assume something. Just make sure you're getting more than one lens to look through.
Very good. And you said the same thing about don't assume. Yeah. So, yeah, no assumptions. You can't know what anybody's story is. Anything else besides no assumptions?
There's just a lot of, single stories out there.
Yes. And we tend to do that. If we know one person who is from a culture or from a place or from whatever, we tend to then expand that, don't we? To think that everybody's going to be like that. But I love what she said about it's not that the story is wrong, it's that the story is incomplete. We need to have more versions of it in order to have more understanding. Anything you can see yourself doing differently based on what she was talking about there? Well, I've got a couple of suggestions. Oh, I set down my handy dandy tool there. When somebody says something that you think doesn't sound like maybe what you would expect them to say, you can just ask them to explore it a little bit. Why do you say that? Or you can also just ask them to say, tell me more about that. So just go exploring a little bit more. And part of that, this earlier one, oh Lord, what'd I do? Well,
Just push the presentation button.
which one is the presentation button? There.
There you go.
Anyway, but this one, yeah, the why do you say that? Really, I find that I want to say that, use that phrase sometimes when I hear somebody stating something that just really rattles me, that I feel like, oh, I'm not comfortable with what you just said, but I want to know why you said it. So if you'll just get somebody to explain to you why they said what they said, you'll make them aware sometimes of a couple of things. One of the things you can make them aware of is that whatever they just said is not universally accepted. It's amazing sometimes, being a white woman from Arkansas, I can hear people will confide things in me that they think I'm going to be on board with because I'm a white woman from Arkansas. And it's always kind of jarring to them then to realize that no, not every white woman from Arkansas thinks the way you're thinking right now. It's not okay what you just said. It's not okay. And I don't say it's not okay what you just said, but I do say, why do you say that? Just explore a little bit further and convey you hope that they'll think about it a little bit more. But then there are a lot of times when somebody will say something, you really do wonder, where on earth, what made you, what's your experience been that makes you say that? So tell me more about that. You can use these phrases in all kinds of circumstances. One of the biggest things you can do, though, for yourself is learn about yourself. We all have biases. We all have biases. But a lot of times we don't know what they are. But you can go to this website, implicit.harvard.edu, and there's this long-term implicit bias study that researchers at Harvard do. It takes you about 20 minutes, and you can explore all kinds of different biases: skin tone, age, body type, religious, what people wear that would define their religion. There are all kinds of things that you can find out about yourself, all kinds of different biases. It's free, and you can take it repeatedly over the years, or you can do different ones. So, like I say, it's only about 20 minutes, but it's a really worthwhile thing to do. So I urge you to do that. Another one, and it's really funny, but it's got really coarse language in it. Really coarse language in it. But it is so funny. It's only about 2.5 minutes. But if you're a Louis C.K. fan, it's the white male privilege, and it's the 3% conference. So if you'll just Google that one, like I say, it's only about 2.5 minutes. But it really makes you look at white privilege, which a lot of us, might be thinking, oh, there's not that much to it. Watch this. But be prepared. Yeah. So this is just a woman that, now that I'm retired, I still am volunteering in things that I believe in. I tutor for the GED in Spanish up at NWAC 2 days a week. And one of the students that I've been helping got her GED on Saturday night. So yeah. So anyway, find a way that you can make a difference in the world, and that you can reach out to somebody that's not like you in all the ways that you can define not like you. Because we've all got all these different facets, right? But do what you can. We will make this world a better place. Oh, I'm sorry, got to tell you one more story real quick. I have a friend whose son is in medical school at Vanderbilt, right? I mean, obviously, the kid's brilliant. Medical school at Vanderbilt. So his girlfriend is from New Jersey. So when his girlfriend told her parents that she was dating somebody from Arkansas, what do you think their reaction was? Yeah, it wasn't a happy thing.
What did his parents think when he told them he was dating someone from New Jersey? That's what I know.
They're really okay with it. They're pretty, they've been around the block. So yeah, but I thought it was just really interesting that you would think that maybe with, Tyson being here, JB Hunt, BNSF is here, Walmart, all their, Arkansas's got something going on. But we're still viewed as something else. But, that's what's nice about us telling our own story. So we need to tell our own story. Okay, well, thank you all for letting me come and be with you today. Any questions? Anything you want to share? Well, just keep it up. Enjoy yourselves. Get out in the world. Thank you.